If our fourth annual predictions report proves anything, it's this. It's a scary world out there. From cyber attacks on critical infrastructure to global supply chain disruptions, potential terrorist acts, 2019 is going to be incredibly challenging for the resilience community. It's easy to be a leader during a time of growth and success, but the true test comes during dark times. Many leaders lack both the training and the experience to handle a crisis well, much less to lead their organization through one. Even if your organization has robust risk and continuity programs, inappropriate decisions made during a crisis could undermine those efforts and put the entire organization at risk. Tough times can reveal how great a leader you truly are, but you need to prepare yourself for the challenges that lie ahead. Let 2019 be the year you make preparedness a priority. With that in mind, welcome and thank you for joining us for our first webinar of 2019. I'm Chloe Demrovsky, President and CEO of DRI International. I'm pleased to introduce our presenters from the Future Vision Committee, Lyndon Bird, Chief Knowledge Officer and Future Vision Committee Chair, as well as committee members Richard Knowlton and Patrick Alcantara. You can download the Trends and Predictions reports from our resource library, visit drii.org, and log into your DRI account for access. Highlights from the reports can also be seen on our news page, Drive. Check out drive.drii.org for more information. If you have questions for the committee, you can submit them during the presentation in the box on the bottom left side of your screen. Our speakers will answer them in Drive, DRI's bi-weekly e-newsletter, when the presentation is made available on the DRI website. So, we'll start the presentation today with Lyndon. Thanks for taking the time with us.
Hello and welcome. I'm Lyndon Bird, DRI International's Chief Knowledge Officer and Chair of the Future Vision Committee. Today we're going to look at the 2019 Resilience Trends and Predictions Reports. Our agenda today will focus mainly on the Predictions Report, which was recently published. I will provide an overview of some of the key issues, followed by a more in-depth look at three of the main prediction areas. I will be helped today by two expert members of the committee, Richard Knowlton and Patrick Alcantara. Richard will look at cyber and Patrick will consider pollution and sustainability. I will conclude with a look at another global issue, that is the risks that we face from any supply chain disruptions. So let's look at some background to the work that we do as a committee. Well, the Trends and Predictions Report is something we produce annually, and this is normally around December. The Predictions Report typically comes out about 4 weeks after the Trends Report. The committee is chaired by myself and includes experts from around the world. They have different business experience and come from a different range of sectors. I am today joined by two members who have particular expertise in the topics that we are promoting today. That is Richard Knowlton and Patrick Alcantara. We have two reports. The Trends Report looks at a global risk landscape. This is something we review not only from our own professional perspective, but by studying and researching into other publications and other thought leadership definitions of where the world is going and where the risk landscape lies. So we then try and boil that down a little bit and identify specific issues that are particularly interesting to the resilience professional, and then a little bit more granular down into the regional and sector analysis. And then finally within that report, an increasingly important part of the report, in fact in recent years, has been to look at the role of the resilience professional themselves, how that is evolving, how that is changing, and how effective they are in dealing with some of the current global risks that are being identified. The Predictions Report looks back on the previous year's events and makes 10 forecasts for the new year. Today, in this webinar, we will look at 3 specific forecasts selected from our 2019 list. And in order for you to better understand these or look at them or enjoy them more, when we finish the webinar, it would probably be very useful for you to go onto the DRI website and look and find the following reports. So the first one of these is the International Global Risk and Resilience Trend Report, and this is available in the resource section of the DRI website. And we will not be talking in great detail due to time pressures today about this report, but I will be discussing it in more detail at DRI 2019. So if you're interested in hearing more and you're attending the conference in Vegas, I really look forward to discussing it with you there. The information that we use in this trends report is largely based on an annual survey that we conduct amongst DRI certificated holders. And we do this every summer, and it takes us some time to do the analysis to get these reports out by the end of the year. So this year we decided we'd try and extend our collection of data, and so we're going to gain some input, we hope, at the annual conference, and follow that up with another survey, another questionnaire just after the conference. So we're going to hopefully find more information, particularly about the role of the DRI and generally resilience professionals. So that is a key part of the trends report. The prediction report is slightly different. We say this is resilience predictions for the profession by the profession. It is now also available to you to study on the website. But this is a shorter report, and it's made with predictions that we as a committee produce and then discuss and agree with other thought leaders and experts that from within the ranks of the DRI. So that is where this comes from, and this has become a really interesting and important feature of the thought leadership stream that's coming from the DRI today. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to the actual prediction areas for this year. And as you can see, they are pretty wide, and they cover a whole range of activities and problems and issues. Some are geographical, some are sectional, some are totally global. And three of the totally global issues, I think, are cyber, supply chain, and pollution sustainability. And we're going to be talking about those in the individual sessions. So what I'll do now is just run through quickly a little bit of information about the 7 areas that we are not going to be discussing in too much detail today. Okay, so firstly, terrorism. And we've got a prediction for terrorism, which we'd like to share with you, and hopefully not worry you too much, but it is quite a chilling prediction in many ways. So what we predicted for terrorism is that it will make a significant return to Western targets, with the remnants of ISIS and a revitalized Taliban competing for control. At least one coordinated attack on a large U.S. city and several lone wolf attacks in others can easily be expected. So that is our prediction for this year, that the relative peace we've had from terrorism in the past year or so in Western areas is likely to not continue. Our prediction then on business change, slightly changing the intensity of this one from our terrorism prediction, but it is a more positive one in that a leading European car manufacturer announces that they are stopping development of gasoline and diesel cars and will concentrate in the future solely on electric vehicles. And we're already seeing part of this happening with announcements from Volvo. Ford are entering into joint ventures to look at developing electric commercial vehicles. So I think the direction of travel towards electric vehicles is gathering pace. How much of it we will actually see in 2019 will be interesting, but our prediction suggests at least there will be some significant announcements. Moving forward then to flooding and extreme weather, I think it's probably no surprise to anyone that we'll have a prediction on this, given the situation with the enormous amount of problems with flooding and extreme weather in 2018. And so what we've actually focused on is business rather than where the flooding and extreme weather will continue. So the business prediction we've made on this is that there will be major flooding on the U.S. East Coast, and it will lead to a severe Boston to Washington corridor business disruption for a significant period of time. So we're looking at some significant business problems there. Another area where significant business problems are certainly likely to arise, if our prediction is correct, and that is in the financial world. We are suggesting that a U.S. financial downturn will be triggered by overvalued tech stocks, combined with other issues, in particular the reduced growth in China, and on a more parochial level, but still adding to the chaos, a possible chaotic exit from the European Union by the UK, leading to a global financial crisis. So that is one that has been predicted for a number of years yet by many experts without it actually happening, but we see many of the signs coming together that would suggest that we are not going to have such benign financial conditions in 2019 as we've had in 2018. So the last three predictions are going to be falling into sort of regional categories. So we're going to predict for the Middle East, something which perhaps is not a great surprise, but it's a summary of where we are. So in the Middle East, we think regional conflict will continue. We see no lasting settlement to the Yemen civil war, and we see the situation in Syria leading to power struggles over the political and economic management and the role of foreign powers. Turkey will become the major player in that region. Relations with Saudi will deteriorate, and the Kurdish pressure for independence will increase. All of these will be very much in the orbit of Turkey, so we see that as a key player in the Middle East this year. And Latin America is number 9 on our forecast list, and we forecast there'll be political upheaval in Brazil, increasing economic problems in Argentina, an ongoing migration crisis in Venezuela. We'll have severe unrest, and the economic and political problems spread right across the continent. And finally, Far East, again, extending a trend which has been happening for some time now, and that is that China will expand its domination of the South China Sea, and the protests from the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia and Vietnam will get stronger. There will be much discussion in the United Nations, but there will be no direct action against China, and China will continue its expansionist program. So these are the forecasts that we are putting forward, that you can judge us on a year from now. Obviously, none of them are expected to be exactly perfectly right, but we think we've got the correct direction of travel for the world. At this stage, then, I'd now like to hand over to our first guest on the webinar today, and that is Richard Knowlton, who's going to talk more about the issues related to cyber threats. So can I? Okay. I'd now like to introduce Richard Knowlton, who is an international expert on many aspects of security, having worked with leading organizations around the world. He founded Richard Knowlton Associates in 2014, and he works with international partners and associates to provide advice on corporate and digital security at the highest level. I'd now like to ask Richard to share his wisdom with us on this webinar. Richard.
Thanks, Lyndon, and hi, everybody. I put up a slide that summarizes what the Future Vision Committee is predicting for cyber threats in 2019. I won't read it out, except to emphasize what I think are the three key elements. First, a serious cyber attack seems inevitable. Second, it's likely to be on the critical national infrastructure. And finally, it'll be carried out by sophisticated threat actors. And we're not alone in pointing up the threat. Just last week, a Pew Research Center paper followed us by saying that 8 out of 10 experts expect successful cyber attacks on the critical national infrastructure in the near future. Equally worrying, less than half of those experts believe that industry is prepared to effectively defend against these threats. I'd like to spend the next few minutes unpacking our prediction and explaining how a cyber attack on the CNI can affect every organization in the country where it happens. As you can see from my next slide, I'm going to look at this prediction under 5 headings, starting with the threat landscape. To be honest, anybody making predictions on cyber threats is going to sound pretty depressing. You might even think that people like me take a certain pleasure in making your spines tingle at all the bad things that are going to happen. To which I can only say that the security threat landscape in cyber has never been more challenging. Organized crime and state actors are increasingly sophisticated and effective, let alone all the other hackers out there who are causing trouble for their own reasons. All of our organizations will sooner or later suffer a serious cyber incident. In fact, we probably already have, even if we don't know it yet. And certainly don't think that you'll escape because your organization is small and not particularly prominent. If you are small, you're likely to have weaker defenses and so are easier to rip off. Or it might be that you're a stepping stone in the supply chain of a bigger and more juicy target, a backdoor for the hackers. I'm sure that most of you already have plans to mitigate the effects of a cyber attack on your organization to ensure that its impacts are manageable and to guarantee that your business can keep functioning. But this year, we're highlighting what may be an indirect risk to you, a large-scale state-sponsored attack on the critical national infrastructure. So let's look next at the CNI. Definitions do vary from country to country, but they will always include food and water supply, healthcare, energy supply, communications, transport, and finally the finance sector, particularly banking. Why do governments identify certain sectors as critical? Simply because a major incident involving these sectors is a potential threat to society as a whole, to its stability, its economy, and even to public safety. Now, obviously, organizations in the CNI face exactly the same cyber risks to their IT systems as the rest of us. We've seen the health sector in several countries subject to serious ransomware attacks, for example. And the finance sector has been ripped off for tens of millions of dollars in attacks on the SWIFT international payments messaging system. These so-called conventional cyber attacks are not going to stop anytime soon, unfortunately. But in many parts of the CNI, we're also seeing targeted attacks on the operational technology, or the OT, that manages the industrial control systems for a power station or a railway network, for example. Here I'd like to spend a couple of minutes discussing an issue which is still not widely understood outside specialist circles. It may initially sound a bit techy, but it's actually really important for all of us in resilience to understand the challenges. The management of operational technology systems has traditionally been separate from that of IT. In fact, OT and IT engineers have had quite different philosophies. OT systems exist to ensure visibility, reliability, and safety. They are designed to run for years without maintenance, and often OT engineers will say that if a system ain't broke, don't touch it. There's an obvious reason. Taking operational technology systems offline for whatever reason will obviously have a major impact on service delivery. On the IT side, though, reliability and security are the dominant themes. IT engineers regularly update software, and frequent security patches are normal and essential. Now, that difference of approach between OT and IT didn't seem to matter too much in the good old days. After all, why on earth would anybody want to attack safety systems? Well, those old days are certainly seeming much more innocent now. Just one example. At the end of 2017, hackers introduced a malware called Triton into a Saudi Arabian petrochemical processing plant. The attack began with a penetration of the plant's IT network, probably using conventional social engineering tactics to persuade an engineer to download an infected file. The hackers were then able to move to the operational technology network through systems that were accessible to both environments. Once on the OT network, the hackers were able to infect the engineering workstation for the safety systems, usually situated in an isolated network segment. Triton, the malware, reprogrammed the safety system controllers, causing them to enter a failed state. Luckily, that caused an automatic shutdown of the industrial process and led to an investigation and to the detection of the hack. I say luckily because this was a serious warning for a future that unfortunately is already here. We tend to think of these attacks as state-sponsored, but organized crime is active here too. We're now seeing deliberate and targeted ransomware attacks on OT systems. In one case I know, ransomware was inserted into the systems of a small downstream supplier, which was providing an essential component to a much more important company in the CNI. Whatever the source of the attack, it's now essential for OT and IT engineers to work together to monitor and react fast when there is an incident. That's particularly true in a case like the Triton attack, where sophisticated malware has the ability to pivot within and between systems. At this point, let me say a bit about the role of state actors. It's been clear for a while that some states are weaponizing cyber techniques for use in future conflicts, including against civilian populations. For example, they may want the capability to deny electricity to an entire city, as happened in Ukraine in 2015. As we say in the introduction to our prediction, the perpetrators could come from a wider group of countries than normally assumed. Well, we all know about the smart teenagers sitting in their bedrooms who've accessed the most heavily defended systems of highly sophisticated governments like the USA. This is the asymmetric, the David and Goliath threat. In the same way, relatively small states can inflict significant cyber damage on much more sophisticated and well-resourced targets. In all of this, bear in mind that there are no internationally accepted rules of the road for this kind of cyber activity, as there was with nuclear proliferation in the Cold War. And even if there were, how could we be sure that rogue states, let alone terrorists, would actually respect them? So far, the major state actors seem to be informally applying the old rules that covered the use of nuclear weapons in the Cold War. There is a limit to how far they want to provoke retaliation. But some of the world's smaller rogue states may not show such restraint. What would a government regard as an act of war in such a context? How should a government react if a cyber attack takes down its national power and internet for a significant period, or if ATMs stop working, or transport networks grind to a halt? Well, by now your spine should all be tingling. It's easy to get depressed, thinking that the bad guys have all the advantages, and that all we can do is play catch-up. Well, as I said earlier, it's true that none of this is going to get much easier, but it's not the whole story. There's plenty that we can all be doing to make a real difference in our organization's preparedness. Not all of you work in companies designated as part of the critical national infrastructure, but just remember that wherever you are, your organization will certainly feel the effects of any major cyber attack on that infrastructure. So what to do? Start by reminding yourself what your government regards as its critical national infrastructure, and then identify the CNI sectors that are crucial to your organization. I guess that for all of you, access to power, communications, fuel, transport, and money are going to be central. Think methodically through what a disabling incident in each of these areas might look like, and what the impacts could be for your organization. Many of us have had to manage similar critical situations for our businesses in general strikes, severe civil unrest, revolution, or even wars. A really challenging experience for me was in Egypt during the Arab Spring some years ago. At that time, the government ordered a shutdown of the internet, which cut off company communications with the outside world, and of the banking sector, which meant that there was no money to pay workers or suppliers. Just getting my business through the collapse of these two key parts of the CNI was a stiff challenge, but it provided some great learnings too. In particular, I'd suggest that you talk with the agencies in your country responsible for critical national infrastructure issues. They can advise you on their own thinking about the risks and impacts and what they see as priority areas for action. You should also exchange thoughts and ideas with your peers. In Egypt, resilience and security managers from a wide range of sectors came together in mutual support. That's an incredible force multiplier in planning for and then managing a real-life incident. Work now to develop those trust relationships with your peers. And finally, your plans will need regular review in the light of fresh intelligence about the threat landscape and changing circumstances in general, perhaps in your own organization. All of which is going to keep you busy on some really interesting ongoing work, of course. I wish you good luck with it.
I'd now like to introduce Patrick Alcantara, a person that I've worked with some time over the years and always impressed by his knowledge of global issues. Patrick is currently working on looking at consumer and business technology trends at Telefonica UK, and he was a head of research at the Business Continuity Institute, and he's an editorial member of the Journal of Business Continuity Emergency Planning. So Patrick's specialization in many ways is global issues such as sustainability, ethical supply, and pollution-related issues. So I think we're going to learn a lot from Patrick today. So my pleasure to welcome Patrick.
Thank you for the introduction, Lyndon, and I appreciate everybody tuning in today. So looking at this next slide, we can see that sustainability and ethical consumption aren't just buzzwords, as these would increasingly form the basis of consumer demand in the future. Consumers are keen to reduce waste and are increasingly averse towards excess packaging, and will be challenging companies to enable them to reduce their environmental footprint. So here are some key insights that support the DRI's prediction about sustainability as a trend in 2019. This insight neatly leads into the next slide, which summarizes how consumers will increasingly hold companies into account. So as we mentioned earlier, consumers are ready to name and shame companies and are more capable than ever to sustain backlash, which negatively affects resilience and bottom line. Sustainability and ethical consumption will be key to unlocking future consumer demand and engagement. And trends suggest lasting changes in behavior as shown below. So number one, the availability of ethically sound offers will drive more routine ethical consumption. Growing eco-ethical expectations will require constant pivots and new messaging from brands and companies to ensure that they are quote-unquote woke. Number two, social enterprise is a firmly embedded feature of CSR policies. Profit and the protection of the people and the planet will become natural bedfellows in the future. Number three, supranational efforts to effect positive change will continue. The consumer's expectation that companies and states, not necessarily the individual, should take primary responsibility for taking care of the environment, and that expectation will be rising in the near future. Number four, public scrutiny refocuses on big industries, especially ones that still lack transparency in their supply chains. On the other hand, a number of eco-brands will manage to scale and remain sustainable as well as profitable. So you can see in this slide that we have evidence that supports this claim. So number one, you've got more consumers, especially younger and more affluent ones, are pushing back against the idea that profitability and economic growth can come at the expense of the environment. And companies risk significant backlash if they ignore this. In the UK, for example, there is growing consensus that companies should be penalized for not taking care of the environment. And you can see here that 71%, so almost 3/4 of UK consumers are saying that companies should be penalized for not taking care of the environment. And companies who employ suppliers that pollute the environment will take the blame and suffer from reduced customs. On the other hand, there are multiple opportunities to turn sustainability and ethical consumption as a driver of resilience and growth. Companies around the world have responded to this challenge and are disrupting traditional business models. So I've got 3 examples here. Number 1 is Plumo in the UK, which uses feathers from poultry farms to produce biodegradable thermal packaging solutions. This can be used by food and pharmaceutical companies who require packaging for products that need to remain cool. Number 2, Procter & Gamble has recently redesigned packaging for Tide detergent, which is bought online. The new Tide container now comes in a rectangular box with a tap at the bottom, which looks like boxed wine that you can buy from the supermarket. So this shape is optimized for shipping and now contains 60% less plastic and 30% less water than the regular bottle. Number 3, in the US, you've got the company Wild Earth, which now creates dog food from meat alternatives. According to their website, dogs and cats account for 30% of meat consumption in the US, which has a damaging impact on the environment. So Wild Earth's first product is a koji fungi dog protein, and it's being marketed as treats. And according to Wild Earth, this fungi is a complete protein for dogs, containing all 10 of their essential amino acids. So it is quite clear from these examples that companies would need to consciously redefine their business models in order to become better stewards of the environment and avoid the harsh bite, again, excuse the pun, from consumers who demand higher standards for the products they consume. So looking at the next slide, this leads us to a few key takeaways, which considers the issues of sustainability and ethical consumption as a basis for resilience and business growth. Number 1, sustainable, ethically sourced, and environmentally friendly products will be core to future consumer demand, especially retail and tech goods. More consumers are conscious of their environmental footprint and will demand that companies help them reduce it. This won't be limited to premium products, and this will eventually trickle down to mass consumption. Number 2, companies that ignore sustainability and ethical consumption do so at their own peril, because consumers will be voting with their wallets. And considering that more affluent consumers are more vocal about their demand for quote-unquote good products, companies stand to lose business by not heeding this. Number 3, reputation loss arising from consumer backlash is a key threat to companies in this space, and resilience professionals have to be aware of this. Consumers will not think twice about naming and shaming companies who ignore environmental issues or employ suppliers with dodgy human rights, environmental, or labor practices. Number 4, and this is quite important, corporate social responsibility is increasingly becoming a hygiene factor, and resilience professionals can certainly play a part in this. Environmental sustainability and ethical practice should be part of a company's risk calculus and provides an excellent opportunity for resilience professionals to showcase their expertise. It is quite clear CSR isn't optional in this current business climate, and in fact is one of the core factors to ensuring continued customer demand, brand engagement, and financial performance. With that, thank you very much for your time, and I would like to hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Patrick, for what I think was a very interesting and innovative presentation. It gave us plenty of cause for thought in the resilience industry. What I'd like to do, though, to consider our third prediction for this particular webinar is to talk about supply chain. Now, supply chain is always a prediction. whenever we do the prediction, we always predict there will be problems with supply chains, that will have continuity problems. Most years there are in many years examples of supply chain problems. Many of these are commercial problems with supply chains going bust or occasionally disruptions from natural disasters, sometimes deliberate actions, but more often than not technology failure or natural disasters which cause problems to a supply chain. However, in general terms, organizations manage to cope with that. And we have been looking at this, and we've decided that in terms of our prediction for this year, that we think inevitably a major incident will occur. And if it does, it's almost certainly going to have a cyber element to that. So what we'll be talking about in there will actually link quite closely with the information that was discussed with Richard earlier in the webinar. And we think that there'll be a denial of access, a data breach, or some type of cyber attack which will be coordinated with a physical attack. And this is how we think that the real problems with cyber combined with supply chain could manifest themselves in 2019, or if not, certainly at some point in the future. So our prediction, the prediction we've made for this particular area is a fairly simple one. A coordinated cyber and physical disruption to the supply of telecom components made in Asia causes chaos in the global cell market. Now, this is quite a specific thing to say, and we must always recognize that when we talk about something like this, that this is only an illustration of what could happen. But nevertheless, it does make a reasonably justifiable case when you look at the issues that are surrounding supply chain at the moment. But before we do that, I'd like just to step back a little bit and challenge why supply chain disruption is seen as a large issue for the continuity or resilience profession. Why is it a continuity issue? Well, typically, decades ago, when business continuity and disaster recovery was in its infancy, people tended to only think about disruptions that took place to your own facilities. That was things that were under your direct control. You tended to assume that supplies would arrive and this would not be part of what you would be considering in continuity. But as the way that business changed dramatically, we suddenly begin to realize that we can be affected in terms of failure to be able to continue our business processes, to run our operational services, by the effects of other organizations equally as the problems we may have internally. And this has been made worse by certain factors. The most obvious one of these has been globalization. Globalization, although giving many benefits, has also, unless properly managed, created less resilience. So we have actually, with going for a global solution where we totally disconnect, where we design product, make products, sell products, where distribution and logistics are extremely disconnected from other aspects of the process, we have created a situation in which we have efficiency. We do what we're good at in the part of the world that's best at doing it at the lowest price, but in so doing, we've increased supply lines and we've increased risk, and we've not always added the necessary measures to mitigate that risk. So globalization has been a driving factor in making supply chain disruption a serious continuity issue. Almost at the same time as globalization took hold, such processes as just-in-time became popular and the normal way of operating businesses. So just-in-time, at its heart, is about reducing the levels of inventory in the overall supply chain. But by reducing the inventory at any point in the supply chain, that gives more possibilities for disruption. And disruption at any point in the supply chain can affect any point further down the supply chain. So just in time, together with globalization, has certainly increased the risk factors, and we haven't necessarily always put in place the necessary resilience countermeasures to deal with that. When we have long-distance supply lines, of course, we have more zones to go through, and these zones can be extreme weather zones, they can be political zones. We can be affected by political rest, we can be affected by extreme bad weather in lots of different places. So there are more risks built into the longer supply chain. We've also, in terms of squeezing costs out of our businesses, looked much more at our suppliers, and single sourcing of suppliers is now much more popular than it may have been a few years ago. It may also be unavoidable, and the reason for that is that in international business, a lot of raw material or component suppliers are concentrated in one geographical area. In some occasions, that geographical area may be very small. It may not just be a continent or a single country, but it could actually be a small area within a country where key supplies are actually all concentrated on and supply the rest of the world. So there are concentrations of risk coming out of this approach, which are also adding to our supply chain disruption problems. So those are the problem, why it's a continuity issue, why we have to have solutions to it. Now, there are some fairly conventional supply chain disruption mitigation measures that we know about. Some of them have been fairly well applied. Some are more difficult. Certainly, the easiest way is to try and increase your resilience by having multiple suppliers in different geographical areas. But the minute that you start doing that, then of course you're adding costs, which is the reverse of what globalization and just-in-time are about. And it may, in many cases, be impractical for the reasons I mentioned before, that it may well be that you cannot get suppliers of certain goods and certain raw materials across the world. They may actually be very much localized in particular areas. So the practicality of how you deal with that and spreading that risk geographically, as well as the cost, may make it a not very sensible option. What most organizations have tended to do over the last few years is to try and set up some sort of joint BC programs and exercising with their absolute key suppliers. Now, this, of course, may reduce the impact of disruption because you may well be working closer together and understand the effects of a problem with the supply chain on the customer and the supplier, and work out different ways that you could mitigate that and working together. So it should have reduction. But the problem with that, of course, is most organizations have hundreds of different suppliers. And though many of those are not core and critical, there may well be 10 or 20 that are core and critical. So actually setting joint programs and exercising with that numbers on a large global basis can be perhaps a little bit challenging and not always possible. So it could be that you then have to look at other ways of trying to mitigate the risk. But the legal way, through contractual obligations and SLAs, transfers some of the risk to suppliers from customers, but in reality, it's still the same problem. If the supplier fails and the customer doesn't get the goods, therefore you have a continuity issue. So this has possibility of giving some financial mitigation, but relatively little in terms of operational mitigation. And then, of course, you can do things like reorganizing the strategic way you distribute. You can have larger inventories across your chain, but in different strategic places between where you're getting your goods from and where you're actually taking them to, with interim points that you can distribute to multiple locations from. But again, this is strategic. Again, it will add costs. And if the whole purpose of just-in-time is simply to reduce inventories across the chain, then that probably negates some of the value of that. So these are all ways that people have approached it. And one of the problems with any of these approaches we have found over many years is how people understand what are core suppliers. Normally, this is done by procurement, looking at spend, volume, the amount of purchases from a particular supplier of particular items. Sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes the core business continuity supplier is the one that could stop your operations because of one simple item that isn't particularly expensive, that isn't particularly extensive, but is only available to one supplier somewhere in the world, and we had not flagged that as being that critical. So what is supercritical supply, source of supply to a purchasing and procurement manager may be different to the business continuity or the resilience manager. So we do need to very much understand which of these parts of our supplier and our supply chain are critical to us. However, none of that which I've said to you today is unique. We could have probably made a similar presentation in each of our last 3 or 4 reports that we've done of this nature. What I've tried to introduce today, though, is what I've considered to be perhaps a bigger risk, and that is some sort of targeted supply chain disruption. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, my view of this is, my definition of this is where an organization looks at how to maximize the overall disruption by a combination of physical and cyber means. And let's just think of this very simply. If you disrupt logistic systems through some sort of cyber attack, then in itself, that does not necessarily stop immediately the shipment of goods and the supply chain. As we've said, they go long distance these days. They go to lots of different places. They take some time. Therefore, there is time to sort out your cyber problems whilst your physical shipments are still in train. Conversely, if you have some sort of physical attack on a distribution center or a transport hub, then this could be very difficult for that particular incident to be managed. But if your logistic systems are running and available to you, and you know what you've lost, you know what your delays are, you know what you need to supply where, it is reasonably possible to put in place fallback situations which you can redirect, reschedule, resequence supplies. If you lose both of them at the same time, then neither your physical fallback or your logistics fallback systems will work, and that will cause chaos if the product that you are dealing with is sufficiently extensive and time critical. So could this happen? Well, technically, yes, it certainly could, but this isn't something that is going to happen by accident or by a small-scale organization trying to get, for example, a ransom. To me, this is something that can only be done on a very well-organized, well-financed, with large resources and a big scale. You'll also need a lot of insider information, as well as a lot of industry knowledge and a lot of important connections to be able to pull off something of this nature. So it is difficult, and it would only be possible if there was sufficient motivation and reward for doing it. And that's much more likely to be geopolitical and strategic rather than criminal and financial. So if we think who might want to disrupt a particular strategic global market, then you may find that you could make your own answers to that, but you could think possibly of candidates who might wish to look at disruption to a particular flow of a market. And the reason for the prediction is just throwing a few nuggets at you and trying to put them together in some way which may not all join up together, but interestingly come out in a similar sort of pattern. Just a few things that have happened in the last few weeks. Apple's loss of share and their disappointing performance in China, which they have used as a major reason for overall disappointing sales in the last quarter. Then think of a tit for tat, as it may be argued or may not be argued, depending on which side of the fence you are, of the arrest of a top Chinese executive in Canada, which is not the first of these. There are Canadian executives being held in arrest in China, and there are issues going on there. We think of an increasing US-China trade war. And we think of the product that every single person in the world now seems to own, mobile phones. This is a product that people can't do without. This is a product that younger people in particular just see as a total and absolute essential part of life. Everyone has at least one, and the next battleground for this is the 5G technology, which China claims to be ahead of the Western, and we clearly see the potential for some need for strategic disruptions of this market, or possibly some problems where there is a connection between geopolitics and business. So I think that there's interesting market to look for. I think that it is a market where failure could cause a lot of chaos very quickly, and I think it is a market where you might be able to see some motivation and reward for some deliberate attacks. This is purely the reason why we have made this very specific prediction. And of course, just to conclude, you have to remember that predictions are unlikely to be exactly correct. We do think, however, that the predictions we make are in the right direction. We do think they indicate how the world is moving, even if we don't get the facts exactly right. Some things that we suggest might not happen at all, and some things we suggest might happen, but then have totally unexpected consequences. Sometimes the consequences may be positive, which we hadn't expected, although in some of these areas it's difficult to view too many positive consequences. Nevertheless, I think it's very interesting to explore predictions. We do that to enhance our knowledge and also to better check whether the programs we're putting in place actually are likely to meet today's challenges. So I definitely would like to again thank Richard and Patrick for their expert contributions today. I'd like to remind you that we are going to continue the debate at DRI 2090 in Vegas in just a few weeks' time. I hope that there are many of you there. I hope that those that are there have listened to the webinar will come up and introduce themselves, and I hope that you actually come on my session, which is on the first day of the conference. But I'll make one prediction before we close the sessions today, and that is that if you go to Vegas, you will really enjoy your visit. That's one prediction. The second one is, but you will not necessarily be richer when you leave. So on that basis, I would just again like to thank you all and hope to see you in Vegas. Thank you very much.
All right. That's about all we have time for today. I want to thank our speakers again. We invite you to join us at DRI 2019 in Las Vegas. And on February 18th, for a special session, Lyndon Bird will be answering your questions about what 2019 has in store. This year's content features a first-ever geographic breakdown of threats and preparedness worldwide. If you still have questions that we didn't cover, give us a call at 866-542-3744. A recording of this and all our other webinars is posted on the DRI website. This webinar has been a production of DRI International 2019, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.